Well, welcome. In today's Theology Bite, I'm covering the Bible, Part 1. All right? And we'll do an overview of the Bible, an overview of the Old and New Testament here, okay? So when you look at the Old Testament, what is the Old Testament? Well, it's history of humanity, history of sin in the world, history of the nations of the world. It's not exhaustive in that, it's focused, but it gives us history of the nations it does focus on. It gives us the history of Israel specifically, God's chosen people. And it talks a lot about the covenant between God and Israel. Covenant is key to understanding what the Old Testament talks about. The covenant, there's a number of them. One of the primary ones in the Old Testament that helps you understand what the interaction of God with the people of Israel is a covenant in Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30, those chapters. It's really a covenant about obedience and blessing, or disobedience and cursing. It's a really key passage to understand. So that's one part. But there's other covenants throughout the Old Testament that help us understand what we're reading. In the Old Testament, you have the promise of Messiah, the anointed one, a long-expected prophet, this amazing person, and it's mentioned throughout the Old Testament, and it's an expectation in the Old Testament. Some of the major people in the Old Testament, you might be familiar with some of these names: Adam and Eve, the first human beings created by God. You have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Samuel and David. There are what we call major prophets. Major simply refers to how long their books are. And they're significant prophets, but so are some of the other ones. But Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, some of the significant or longer books in the Old Testament from the prophets. Then we have minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, so on. There's a number of them, and their books are much shorter in length, typically. Not less important, just shorter. And the Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi. And this book was written around 440 to 400 years before the birth of Jesus. And then the period right after that, from Malachi to Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, that period of time, about 400 years or so, it's referred to as the intertestamental period. All right? It's really a period of silence. So it's a period between the Old and New Testament. Now the New Testament, let's talk about the New Testament here. The New Testament covers the life, ministry, and teaching of Jesus. In the first 4 books, they're referred to as the Gospels. Gospel is simply a word that means good news. And those focus on the life and the ministry of Jesus. The next book, the book of Acts, or Acts of the Apostles, covers the beginning of the church and the growth of the church in the world at that point. Then the rest of the New Testament contains letters which were written in the middle of the first century, towards the end of the first century, some of them, but mainly in the middle of the first century, written by some of the apostles to the various churches that had been planted in the towns and cities of the Mediterranean Roman world at the time. All right? And the New Testament covers the beginning of the church, obviously the life and ministry of Jesus, but the beginning of the church, the early history of the church, future of the world, and in theology we call that eschatology, but it talks about God's plans for the world in the future. It gives commands and instructions to believers or followers of Christ of how we should live. It gives us commands and instructions as to how the church should function and so on. Let me give you just a quick summary of the Bible as we close. All right, 66 books, 39 Old Testament, 27 New. Written by over 40 writers over a period of 1,500 years, 40 generations. Written in 3 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The bio of the different writers, this is just a sampling, and you can see the variety here is extensive. Political leaders, army generals, kings, a prime minister, prophets, tax collector, doctor, so on. All right? Now in the next video, I'm going to cover how the Bible has been translated over the centuries, how the 66 books of the Bible that we have, how were those selected? So we'll cover those things in the next video. And I hope you join me for that, Bible Part 2.